All right, good morning. I am Michael Hauck, as always, your host of How to Change. And with me today, I have a special guest. I have Malcolm McAuley joining me from the Great White North.
It's not white yet, but it won't be long, I'm sure.
All right. Malcolm, thanks for joining. Before we dive into the topic at hand, of course, which is change management and all things change, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and where you came from and your journey and what you're doing now?
Oh, yeah, it's a loaded question, but I'll try and keep it succinct. So my name's Malcolm McAuley. I am a practice lead here at C5 Insight, and so we do technology-related deployments. And so my role today is very different from what it started way back, which is why I wanted to jump on with you. I was so excited when you reached out because change has been a mainstay and I think it's a mainstay for all, and we'll get into that later. But it's been a mainstay in my career because I'm one of those people who started in this totally different path and trajectory and somehow found myself managing these systems and inside of this. So we can talk through that process. But
Awesome.
but that was a huge shift. And so change has always been there, and it's always been a mind set for me that we have to embrace change because it can bring some really great stuff, but also that it's terrifying for people and that it comes with all these nuances and caveats and crazy things. So just a quick background. Actually started as a social worker, a social service worker program graduate, and started in the nonprofit realm and managing actual work, working with individuals and through challenges and problems for a mentoring organization for a while. So was very much enthralled in that world. And then somebody actually approached me and said, they didn't use these words, but effectively said, you're clearly a nerd. And we would love to maximize that nerd in you. And so can you kind of help us manage this system? And so fast forward now nearly 20 years, and here we are. All things Power Platform and Microsoft specifically is kind of in my purview. So it's been an interesting journey for sure, and we'll touch on some of the weird parts of that. But yeah, that's kind of the overview of who I am and where I'm at.
So because some of that I didn't know, which is awesome
Sure.
because now I have off the recording, I have other questions to ask you and things to discuss with you, but we'll save that for another time. But personal reflection, I just want to make sure, I want to clarify for the audience. It wasn't your wife, your spouse that referred to you as a nerd, correct? It was
Oh,
somebody in
she
business.
does on a
Because
regular
mine, yeah,
basis.
mine
Yes.
either calls me a geek or a nerd all the time, and I just
Yeah,
just want to be clear for the audience that this was
sure.
business related, not
It
just
was.
our significant others perspectives. All right. So, standard question that I like to ask guests when they come on the show is simply, what does change management mean to you? And I realize it's a lot of things, and we could spend a lot of time on it, but kind of give
Yeah.
me your elevator pitch for what change management is to you and why it matters.
It's trust. That is the biggest term to me. So change is all about trust. In my opinion, when we look at change, the only reason we're going to make a change in anything, right, whether it's technology adoption or just general life change, it's that we trust that that change is going to bring some kind of tangible benefit in some way, shape, or form. And so that could be as simple as, and I'm going to use a specific example. You brought up spouses. I keep my keys in a very specific spot, and that's just where they go. And it perhaps is a little rigid, but it's where they just landed several days, and that's where I began to look for them. And so that's just where they belong. And so having a 17-year-old who now drives, they find themselves, the keys, I mean, in all kinds of random places. And so we've had some recent discussions about it just goes there. And so there's this topic of like, but can't that change? And so this is to me a good example of this. What's the tangible benefit for moving them, right? And so for me, the tangible benefit for not moving them and not changing that practice is I don't need to waste time looking for them. They're not necessarily next to the door. They're actually a fair way away from the door, but I know exactly where to go on the path at the door. And so I know that that absolutely sounds cold and rigid and like, dude, just lighten up. But I think it's an important aspect of why people do or don't change. There is not a tangible benefit to moving them because they're baked into the process. There is no problem with that process. It works fine. We grab the keys and we go out the door. And so that's an interesting example I think I've used a couple times.
It's a great example, and I want to dive into the trust a little bit because I like that element for a lot of different reasons, and especially in the corporate world. right? When you talk about change and you talk about trust and those issues that come with it. But, if somebody doesn't know you at all, and obviously I know you through the community, and I know a lot of people know you through the community. By the way, congratulations on your community award. Well deserved.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
But I think, at a first glance, somebody say, oh, he's really rigid, right? To your point, because of this simple little thing. But yet in your job, you're actually a change agent, right?
Yeah,
You are
100%.
bringing change to your customers. And it's really funny to me because typically when people hear the word change, more often than not, I'm generalizing, of course, but it's a very black and white thing. Either somebody says, I hate change, or somebody says, oh yeah, I'm all about change. I love change, right? And I really like when people say that, because usually my standard response when somebody says that they're really, they love change and they thrive on change and everything else is I'll say, do you have an iPhone or an Android? And they'll tell me, and I get, okay, good. We're going to switch now. I'm going to give you the other one. And they're like, whoa, time out. No, I don't like that. I'm like, well, wait a minute. That's change. What's the price? So to your point, I think if you understand change and why, especially again in corporate America, it doesn't matter if it's commercial or nonprofit, right? Why change is kind of inevitable and important. That doesn't mean that you can't be rigid about the things that make sense to be rigid about, and that you can kind of be both at once.
Yeah, I would agree. I would totally agree. And it's, again, dialing back to trust. It's, do we trust that that change is there for a reason? And a colleague of mine will say all the time, people's favorite radio station is WIIFM, right? What's in it for me? And I think that's clever, because that's the ultimate question in personal
Absolutely.
or corporate, right? Sure, we'll entertain this change. What am I going to get from this? How am I benefiting from this? So that, I mean, we hear it all the time. We have to dig into the why, and that's super critical, in my opinion, when it comes to change. We can't just say we're changing because it's going to be better. Why is it going to be better? How is it tangibly increasing efficiency or effectiveness or whatever that it is we're working toward, right? Profitability, for example. So there's just this idea of, I think I'm with you. I love when people say they want to change, but I want to make sure it's intentional change for a reason, right? That we're not just
Exactly.
changing because we think it's time to change.
Yeah. And I think that ties well into, again, to some extent, you and I kind of work for competitors, right? We do the same thing. We don't bump
Yep.
into each other competitively very often, and I would call us, friendly competitors at that. There's,
Agreed.
I believe, certainly from our side, there's a lot of respect for your organization.
Likewise.
Um, Thank you. But, to me, when I think about what it is that we do, if you generalize and you say CRM, obviously Power Platform is a lot more than CRM, but
Absolutely.
we now use the term revenue operations because we focus on sales, customer service, and marketing. We stay away from the ERP side at Congruent X by
Same.
choice, right? And so when you think about that, oftentimes, we've been talking for years about all the industry statistics that say, only half the organizations are happy with their implementation, right? And I think a lot of that typically is credited towards adoption and usage. And, one of the things that I've seen consistently over the years is because oftentimes, when they're exploring whether they want to fix what they have or whether they want to replace what they have, right? They're doing it because what they have isn't working.
Mhm.
And it's funny to me how often it's, oh, well, we don't have the right technology. And you're like, really? You think that's the problem here,
Right.
right? It's the technology. This technology is that much better than that technology. And so it's an interesting conversation, but the balance, I think, and I want your perspective on this. My perspective is it has to be pretty balanced, but because you've got decision makers and you've got, somebody who's, signing a check on the work that organizations like ours do, they have expectations of what that's going to deliver. What's the value that I'm going to get out of this investment? And so for years, you talk about the carrot or the stick mentality. And, I've literally had organizations say to their salespeople, well, if it's not CRM, it didn't happen. And you're not going to get paid your commissions and, just all of these things that, basically you better use it. We spent the money on it. You better use it.
Right.
And then there's the complete opposite of, okay, well, our sales team is struggling a little bit, so we want to give them a tool that makes it easier for them to do their job. We don't want them to focus on the CRM system. We want the CRM system to help them achieve their goals and help us make more money and those kind of things. And to me, the simple thing is, well, there's got to be balance in there, right? For both sides. So enough of me rambling. Give me your perspective and kind of, not just how you feel about the balance, but kind of how you help achieve the balance, if you will.
Yeah, it's not as simplistic as this, but it boils down to, what does success look like? And that's a question that I see a lot of organizations don't entertain. They do exactly what you're saying. Well, we need to change the tech because it's not working. Well, what's not working? And what does working look like? What does success look like? Because until you define that, I don't know how you'll ever strike that balance, because you don't actually know what you're working toward. There's this mythical target that's there, but nobody actually knows exactly what it is. And we can narrow it a little bit and say, well, we want to increase revenue. Great, but what does that mean? Does that mean if you draw in an extra $300 a year, you've increased your revenue? Probably not, right? Your targets are probably a substantial step dictates increase in revenue. So what is that step, and what are you working toward? And then in terms of achieving the balance, to me, it's about working backwards, right? This is effective for any project, in my opinion. Where are we going? And Brene Brown actually has I love this. I actually have it on my computer. It says paint done. And it's this idea of, when we get started on anything, what are we doing? What does done look like? And once we understand what done looks like, then we can create this work back plan and be like, well, in order to achieve that, the following has to come into play, right? And so to me, that's where you get into the balance, because there are going to be times where you're going to have to say to people, and here we go again, back to trust us, right? Trust us, because this is going to help, but you're not going to realize that benefit until X happens. And so we need your trust along the way, but trust that when we get there, it's going to look like this. And if we realize halfway through it's not going to look like that, then we talk together and craft a new plan and course correct appropriately to get to that step, because we know it's step 4 on the 8 steps to where we're trying to get to. So I think it's a good balance. I think I especially in sales organizations, it's hard to say, just put it in CRM and just trust that it's going to go there. So there's got to be that element of, what's in it for me.
Sure.
Here's how you're going to benefit, right? You're going to be more on top of your job. And those aren't easy conversations to have, because who wants to be told the way you're doing it today isn't quite good enough? Nobody wants to hear that, right? So I think that's one of the challenges, but I think that's the balance, is know where you're going and where you aspire to be, and what's the plan to get there.
I don't want to put you on the spot too much, and I give you a tiny little bit of warning, but not much time to prepare. So I'll summarize it and put it in one question instead of two. Do you have any good examples of either good change management or bad change management with any organizations you've either worked with, or just in your life, of either somebody that got it really, really good,
Right.
or this is the poster child for how not to do change?
Yeah, I definitely have multiple on both sides, more on the latter, unfortunately. But I'd say the ones that I see successful, and I'm just drawing from a few examples, that there is a flexibility to acknowledge that we're not on course, right? We aspired to be here. We started our trajectory, and somehow we went this way or this way, and they acknowledge it, call it out, and it's not the yelling, screaming fit. Why aren't we going to be where we said we were going to be? It's an acknowledgement that variables happen and they exist, and the environments change, and things come up that we maybe didn't anticipate, and that's okay. But the conversation is stern in the sense that, well, then how are we going to make sure we get here? Maybe we're not going to get here at this time. It's going to be here instead. Fair, but how are we going to get there? Not just, well, it's not going to work and we got to take a different path altogether. And so I think those organizations are the ones that I think are embracing the fact that it is truly about achieving the change that they want, and they will stop at nothing. I don't say that in the cold way. They'll stop at nothing to make sure that they get there, even if that means, okay, we're going to need to take a little longer or do it slightly differently than maybe we envisioned in the first place.
Yep.
So I think those organizations are are well positioned, and you can usually hear that pretty early on, when you start talking about deadlines and timelines. And on the converse side, the ones I think that struggle the most, pardon me, are the ones who set non-negotiable arbitrary timelines, right? It has to be done on this date just because. And I respect that. There's an element for that. We've got targets, they've got things, they've got budget that needs to be used. I totally understand that. But I think a lack of flexibility that is going to take into account that variables that we didn't anticipate are going to come into play. Without that, you're setting your team up for burnout. You're setting your team up for stress that they now need to navigate. That's not helping the situation. It's not helping them be more productive. It's probably actually having the exact opposite effect, right? They're now
Definitely.
scrambling, and they're increasing the chance of making a mistake, and it's probably going to get worse. And so again, I totally understand why we have target dates and we need to do that. And I'm not saying let it be loose and just say we get there when we get there, but be willing to understand that sometimes we need to nudge the goal, not what the goal line looks like, but where the goal line sits a little bit at a time. I think those two examples to me exemplify organizations who are well positioned to navigate through change really well, and those who are probably poised for additional challenges as they go through the process.
Great examples. Thank you. And I couldn't agree more. And it's funny, of course, as you're talking and I'm listening, I'm thinking about examples and my life, everything else. And, it's funny to me because a lot of times, when people talk about in the consulting business, in the space that you and I are currently in, right? And you talk about, a consultant's value, and you've got, you could have somebody who's fresh out of school or whatever, and they're absolutely brilliant and they can do a lot of stuff and everything else. But I personally believe that, experience comes into play a lot. And as you were thinking about it, I'm sitting there and I'm thinking about, I feel like I'm at a point in my career now where I can have a call or two with a client or prospective client, right? And you try really hard not to stereotype or put people in a box, right? But
Yeah.
you can kind of, when you're having the conversations with them, you're like, oh boy, they're really rigid in what their expectations here are versus, oh, they get it. Like they
Right.
clearly, and so it's interesting to me, because you're, like I said, you're in kind of the pre-sales mode where you're getting to know them and figure out how you're going to help them and everything else. And you can already go, this is going to be a fun project, or boy, this is going to be some work. Like we've got to educate folks and
Yeah.
help them understand, those kind of things. So since you're nodding your head, I'm assuming that to some extent, at least, you're in agreement. Um, any particular thoughts on, kind of dealing with different type of people? And again, not trying to generalize or categorize people, but, people who seem to be aware and fans of change and what it takes to get to that successful outcome, that painting, right?
Mm.
Versus the ones that, you're going to have to really help them understand what success looks like.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for those who very much thinking on my feet, for those who are very rigid, I think playing into that is helpful, right? Acknowledging that. Maybe they don't call it that. They
Sure.
probably don't consider themselves rigid, but playing into the fact that it's very clear that they're going to need hard timelines and a definite push. And I think that's going to change the way we do our status update calls. It's going to change the way we navigate through the project, just so that they're feeling like there's always forward momentum toward that specific goal, whatever the case may be. I also think that that's probably a scenario where we're going to want more iterative breakdown of goals, right? So it's not just we're starting here and we're going here and we'll get there. It's and at this it's milestones, right? For classic project management stuff, it's here's the milestone that we need to hit in order to make sure that we're on that trajectory. And we're going to tighten that up a little bit with those who are maybe a little more rigid because they need that sense of, well, where are we at, right? That's the question that they're going to ask. Where are we at? How's the budget? How's the timeline? And I think if we can shorten the steps in between and identify clear milestones and work toward those, that's going to help that person or that mentality through that
So I'm
process.
gonna stop you there. The
Yeah.
first thing I'm gonna do is apologize because that was a curveball, and it was an intentional curveball. Again, just because I know you a
All
little
right.
bit, right? And we
Yeah.
didn't talk about that at all before the call.
Yeah.
But the point that I want to make is you just demonstrated your ability to change, and more importantly, how your team would adapt given the client.
Yep.
And I
Yep.
think
For
that's
sure.
so important for people to understand. It's natural when we think about change to think about how they're going to change and how we're going to help them change.
Hmm.
But oftentimes, in order to do that, to help somebody else achieve change, we have to change our
Absolutely.
approach and our perspective to support theirs versus just saying you need to change.
Yep. Yep.
And
I would agree.
I think your example is spot on. And I think it's really, really important for people to understand that a lot of change is about flexibility
Hmm.
and being willing to do what it takes to help somebody else make the change, whether it's conscious or unconscious, doesn't
Hmm.
really matter,
Right.
right? But you can't just say, well, we've done this 1,000 times before, and this is the way you do it, right? It's
Right.
never ever the same.
Yeah. I
E-
agree. Yeah.
Every person's different, and then you know how many people are in the organization, and you've got all these differences and everything else, and so you really have to be flexible and adaptive in your approach based on who the organization is. So thank you
It.
for making the point.
Yeah. No, good curveball. I'm glad I got the bat on it. So,
if you if
but
you you know if you never come on again, we understand why. It's like, oh, I don't know what he's going to ask me to talk
yeah,
about.
I'll
Um,
just wear extra deodorant next time. That's all good. So,
but listen, I don't like to keep these things long, and I really do appreciate your time and insight. Always enjoy talking with you, and I always learn a lot. Um, just kind of in closing, any final remarks that you have for the audience, or and you can go either way, right? Either that, or if people were thinking about change and how to be change agents and how to help people with change, just kind of words of wisdom, or remember this one thing or these three things as you're
yeah.
talking through it.
Yeah, I think you touched on it already, unintentionally. So it's the difference between training and learning. And so there's two parts of that. The first one is that one of the earliest lessons I learned in this specific realm of these applications, and as I started to take them over and support them for organizations, training never stops. So when you create resources and say, but I created it and it's in this centralized location, you can find it. That's not good enough. And if you think it's good enough, you need to reflect on why that's not good enough. And I can go on for a whole episode on why it's not good enough, but I'm telling you, and I'll say, trust me, examine that why that probably isn't good enough, right? Constant reminders of where those reasons are. And here's a hint, we're all wildly busy, and who has time to pause and think about where I'm going to get things? You need to surface them. So that's part number one. Part number two is that there is a difference between training and learning. You can train somebody how to do something and they can build muscle memory, but are they actually learning the benefit? Why are they doing this? Why is this important to our organization? Why do you want me to go through the process this way? Why do those fields need to be filled in? Again, there's a big difference between, okay, I got it. I go through and I do fields 1, 3, 7, and 9 in this scenario. That's muscle memory. But here's why I'm doing that, because it gives us the right information to support this customer. Because at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to help our customers. And in our scenario, we're helping our customers help their customers with whatever it is they're working on. And so helping people to truly learn why they're doing it, and engaged employees will embrace that. It's actually a good marker for those who are super engaged and those who are maybe not. The ones who, it's a maybe controversial opinion, those who are willing to train to just know the motions and go through it day in and day out are probably a different type of employee than those who come in truly wanting to understand why. And I think that's an important factor. It's not to say that the former aren't valuable, they are, but they're probably, the seat that they're going to fill is probably going to look a little bit different because they're they're just working on the things that need to get done, and that's a really important aspect. But we need people to reflect on the why as well. So yeah, that would be all
Awesome.
I'd have. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
I
Appreciate you
appreciate you
sharing
having me on. Yeah.
sharing some
Good time.
wisdom. You're welcome anytime. And I appreciate both the time and the wisdom. And I'm sure I'll be talking to you soon. But
Absolutely.
Thanks, and I'll say happy holidays because I don't know if I'll talk to you before next year at this point or not. But thanks for coming on, Malcolm.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.